The air inside the allured boxing gym hung thick with sweat and dreams when a man in white robes stepped through the rusted door, and every punch echoing against leather suddenly felt like thunder before lightning strikes. No one had announced his arrival. No entourage followed, yet the stranger commanded attention like gravity itself, his dark eyes sweeping across the cramped space where Manila's hungry fighters danced their desperate ballet of survival. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows, but something colder entered with him. A silence that crept between the ropes and wrapped around every throat. Trainers froze mid-shout, their weathered faces turning toward this impossible figure whose pristine thobe seemed to glow against the gym's stained concrete walls. Young boxers stopped their combinations, gloves hanging suspended in air, thick with questions nobody dared to voice. The Sheikh moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had never needed to hurry, his leather sandals whispering against the floor as he observed each fighter with the penetrating assessment of someone weighing souls instead of skills. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an explanation that never came. In the far corner, removed from the frozen tableau, Manny Pacquiao continued his work with the quiet focus of a man who had learned humility in harder rings than this. His gloves struck the heavy bag in rhythmic meditation, each impact a prayer of discipline that required no audience, no validation beyond the honest conversation between fist and resistance. Sweat traced rivers down his weathered face, carrying with it the accumulated years of 1,000 battles, 10,000 training sessions that had transformed a street kid from General Santos into something the world called legend, but he still called work. The Sheikh's gaze eventually found him there, and something shifted in those ancient eyes, a flicker of recognition that had nothing to do with fame. While camera phones remained forgotten in pockets and the gym held its collective confusion like a breath too large to release, the wealthy stranger watched Manny with an intensity that suggested he was looking not at the champion everyone knew, but searching for someone only he could see. The moment stretched between them across the crowded gym, invisible and taut as a wire, waiting to sing. The Sheikh's voice cut through the silence like a blade forged in ancient fires, the classical Arabic flowing from his lips with such purity that it seemed to carry centuries within each syllable. Man huwa al-batal alladhi ya'rifu anna al-sharaf laysa fil intisar bal fil tadhiya min ajli man la yastati'u al-qital. The question hung in the air like incense, beautiful and incomprehensible to the frozen crowd. Each word a test that painted confusion across every face in the gym. Trainers exchanged helpless glances, their expertise suddenly worthless in the face of this linguistic challenge that felt less like a question and more like judgment itself. Young fighters shuffled their feet against the canvas, embarrassment coloring their cheeks as they realized their champion was being addressed in a language that might as well have been starlight. The silence that followed carried the weight of collective inadequacy, the shame of not understanding what honor demanded in this moment. Even the traffic noise from the Manila streets outside seemed too quiet, as if the entire city held its breath waiting for someone, anyone, to bridge this impossible gap. Manny's gloves stopped mid-strike against the heavy bag, his body going still with a focus that transformed the corner from mundane to sacred in a single breath. He turned slowly toward the Sheikh, removing his gloves with deliberate care, each movement carrying the weight of a decision that would ripple beyond this moment into history itself. When he spoke, the Arabic flowed from his mouth like water from an unexpected spring, clear and confident, despite the accent that marked him as a student rather than a native speaker. Al-batal al-haqiqi huwa man yastakhdim quwwatahu li himayat الضعفاء وفهم إخوانه لأن القوة بدون حكمة هي كسيف بلا قبضة. The gym erupted in gasps and murmurs, disbelief crackling through the air like electricity as their champion answered in the tongue of prophets and poets. Manny's eyes never left the Sheikh's face as he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, explaining in flawless Arabic how he had spent countless late nights studying the Quran, not for conversion, but for understanding, driven by a hunger to speak with his Muslim brothers in Mindanao in words that carried respect rather than translation. The Sheikh's stern face cracked like dawn, breaking over mountains, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like hope as he stepped closer to Manny, with hands raised in astonishment. "How does a Christian champion from the south speak the language of the Quran with such reverence?" he asked, still in Arabic, his voice now trembling with an emotion that suggested this answer meant more than anyone in the gym could possibly understand. Manny smiled with the gentle humility that had always defined him beyond the ring's brutal honesty, gesturing toward the busy Manila street beyond the gym's walls where Muslims and Christians passed each other in the daily dance of coexistence. Because true strength is not in the fist alone, but in the heart that seeks to understand all of God's children, regardless of the name by which they call him, Manny replied, his Arabic carrying the conviction of someone who had learned this truth not from books, but from the hard soil of experience. The words settled over the gym like benediction, transforming confusion into wonder, embarrassment into pride that their champion had prepared for a test no one knew was coming. Phones emerged from pockets now, capturing this impossible moment as Manny continued speaking, recounting his journey through Arabic study with the same discipline he brought to roadwork and sparring sessions at dawn. His voice carried stories of Muslim fishermen who had shared their language and faith during his childhood in General Santos, of imams who had welcomed his questions with patience, of late nights when exhaustion from training made the Arabic script swim before his eyes, but purpose kept him studying until understanding came. The Sheikh listened with tears gathering in his ancient eyes, recognizing in this Filipino warrior something that wealth could never purchase and fame could never manufacture, the genuine hunger to build bridges where others saw only divides. Around them, the gym had transformed from a place of embarrassed silence into a cathedral of possibility. Every person present understanding they were witnessing not just translation, but transformation itself. The afternoon, light streaming through the windows, seemed to brighten, as if heaven itself was leaning closer to hear what would come next from this meeting between East and West, between wealth and earned wisdom, between a test and its perfect, unexpected answer. The Sheikh's weathered hands reached into his pristine white thobe, withdrawing a worn leather journal that looked as though it had traveled through every corner of the earth and back again. "I have come to 43 cities across 6 continents," he began, his voice now switching to accented but precise English so all could understand the magnitude of what Manny had accomplished. "I have stood before Olympic gold medalists in Los Angeles who could not spare 5 minutes from their endorsement schedules, before European football champions who laughed at an old man's Arabic as though wisdom itself was a joke." His fingers traced the journal's pages with reverent sorrow, each entry a record of humanity's failures, of fame corrupting the very souls it was meant to elevate into. Examples for the world. The gym pressed closer now, drawn by the gravity of his confession, understanding that Manny had passed an examination that the greatest athletes on earth had failed through arrogance or indifference. His voice carried the weight of profound disappointment mixed with desperate hope, the combination creating an emotional resonance that made even the hardest trainers blink back unexpected moisture. "In Dubai, a champion refused to even see me, sending his manager to dismiss me like a beggar seeking handouts at the palace gates," the Sheikh continued, his accent thickening with emotion as memories pressed against his composure like floodwaters against weakening walls. In New York, a fighter knew 3 words of Arabic: money, contract, payment, as if the language of the prophet existed only to negotiate endorsements rather than illuminate the human spirit. The pages of his journal fluttered as he turned them, each one a testament to wealth meeting emptiness, to physical prowess divorced from moral depth, to the hollowness that fame creates when it feeds only ego. Manny stood before him with hands folded in respect, his humility a stark contrast to the parade of failures the Sheikh described, with increasing anguish and fading hope. Around them, the Filipino fighters felt their chests swell with pride that their champion had succeeded where the world's most celebrated athletes had revealed themselves as spiritually bankrupt despite their golden trophies. The afternoon had shifted from ordinary training into testimony, from routine into revelation that character outweighs celebrity in the economy of true greatness. The Sheikh's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire gym, with the weight of continents crossed and hearts weighed and found wanting. In London, I found a champion whose mansion had 17 bedrooms, but no space for wisdom, whose garage held 20 cars, but whose soul could not carry a single verse of compassion, he said, each word a knife of disappointment cutting through the pretense of worldly success. The leather journal trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he flipped through pages dense with notes, each city name a scar, each athlete's failure a wound that had not yet healed despite the miles and months. Manny's trainers exchanged glances of disbelief, understanding now that their humble champion had accomplished something that transcended boxing, that reached into the realm where character becomes currency more valuable than any purse or belt. The afternoon light streaming through the gym's high windows seemed to intensify, as though heaven itself was bearing witness to this accounting of global emptiness meeting unexpected Filipino fullness. Around them, the heavy bags hung motionless like silent jury members, and the speed bags ceased their rhythmic percussion as every soul present absorbed the magnitude of this moment. The Sheikh's eyes, dark as midnight in the desert, fixed on Manny with an intensity that spoke of a desperate search, finally, impossibly, reaching its conclusion. In Beijing, in São Paulo, in Johannesburg, the story repeated itself like a cruel joke the universe was playing on my mission, the Sheikh continued, his accent growing heavier as emotion overwhelmed precision, making his words more authentic rather than less. He pressed the journal against his chest as though it contained not just names and dates, but pieces of his breaking heart, fragments of hope that had shattered against the marble floors of penthouses and the polished desks of agents who saw an old man rather than a test from God himself. The gym's walls seemed to contract inward, drawing everyone closer to this confession that felt less like storytelling and more like witnessing a soul laid bare before strangers who had become sacred witnesses. Manny remained perfectly still, his calloused fighter's hands clasped in front of him with the same respect he would show entering a church, his posture communicating what words could not, that honor recognizes honor regardless of language or nation or creed. The young boxers who minutes before had been jabbing at shadows now stood transformed into philosophers, understanding that their sport was merely the vehicle for something far greater than championships. Every breath in that space felt synchronized, every heartbeat aligned with the rhythm of a revelation that was rewriting what it meant to be truly victorious. The memory rose in Manny's chest like dawn breaking over the Pacific, pulling him back to General Santos City when hunger had carved his ribs into visible ridges and the sea offered both terror and salvation in equal measure. He was 13, barely more than bone and determination, working the docks where the fishing boats came in heavy with tuna and the air tasted of salt, and desperate dreams that most boys in his position would never realize. That morning the waves had turned violent without warning, transforming from gentle swells into fists of water that slammed against the pier with the rage of something ancient and unforgiving. He had been securing ropes when the wooden planks beneath his feet splintered like matchsticks, plunging him into water so cold it felt like knives stabbing every inch of his skin. The ocean pulled him under with greedy hands, filling his mouth and lungs with brine, his small body tumbling in the current like discarded trash. Through the chaos of churning water and fading consciousness, strong arms wrapped around his chest, hauling him upward toward light and air and the possibility of living beyond that moment. Those arms belonged to Omar, a Muslim fisherman whose weathered face held the entire history of Mindanao's complicated heart. Omar's small house became Manny's second home, a place where the divisions that plagued their island dissolved into shared meals of rice and fish cooked over a small fire. The older man spoke Tagalog with a thick accent, his hands moving expressively as he taught Manny about the sea's moods, about reading weather in the color of the horizon, about strength that came not from violence, but from understanding the currents rather than fighting them. Late into the evenings, Omar would unroll his prayer mat facing west, his voice rising and falling in Arabic that sounded to young Manny like music composed before language itself existed. Between prayers, Omar would explain the words, translating not just their meaning, but their spirit, showing the boy that faith in any form was simply the human heart reaching toward something greater than survival. Manny absorbed these lessons the way dry earth drinks rain, discovering that the language of compassion required no translator. Omar never asked for gratitude or recognition, never mentioned the rescue, treating Manny simply as someone worthy of time and wisdom, a gift that would later seem more valuable than any championship belt. The Sheikh's hands trembled as he lowered himself onto the worn bench beside the boxing ring, his expensive robes gathering dust from the gym floor without concern, his eyes suddenly carrying an ocean of grief that made the muscled fighters around him seem fragile by comparison. His voice dropped to barely a whisper, yet every person in that humid Manila gym heard each word with perfect clarity, as though the air itself had decided this story demanded absolute silence and reverence. He spoke of a son named Khalid, a young man who possessed his father's determination and his mother's gentle heart, who had fallen in love with boxing, not for violence, but for the discipline. It required the way it transformed the body into poetry. Khalid had trained in the finest facilities across Dubai and London, working toward a future where he might represent his country in international competition, carrying the family name with honor into rings around the world. But during a sparring session on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a punch landed at precisely the wrong angle, in the wrong moment, sending Khalid to the canvas in a way that looked routine until he failed to rise. The Sheikh's voice cracked like ancient stone as he described holding his son's hand in the hospital, watching machines breathe for a body that had already surrendered, understanding that all his wealth could not purchase one more heartbeat. Since that devastating afternoon, the Sheikh had traveled the globe searching for a champion who possessed not just physical prowess, but the spiritual depth his son had embodied. Someone who understood that true greatness measured itself in character rather than victories. He had approached famous boxers in Las Vegas who saw only dollar signs, athletes in London who treated his grief as an inconvenience, champions across Latin America who nodded politely but never truly listened to the pain beneath his words. Each meeting had reinforced his growing despair that the modern world had forgotten how to honor memory with substance, that celebrity had replaced genuine nobility, that muscles and marketing had become more valued than wisdom. Standing before Manny in this humble gym with its cracked mirrors and tape-repaired heavy bags, the Sheikh felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that traveled deeper than language or religion. This small Filipino fighter, who answered profound questions in classical Arabic, who trained without entourage or arrogance, who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had known true hardship and emerged with compassion intact. This was the spirit his Khalid had possessed. The Sheikh reached into his robes and withdrew a leather portfolio embossed with gold, his fingers moving to reveal documents that represented wealth beyond imagination, contracts offering Manny endorsement deals worth millions, apartments in Dubai's tallest towers, a percentage of the foundation's vast holdings that would secure generations of his family's future. The other fighters in the gym leaned forward instinctively, their eyes widening at figures that could transform poverty into paradise overnight, at opportunities that seemed pulled from fever dreams rather than reality. But Manny remained perfectly still, his calloused hands resting gently on his knees, his expression carrying neither greed nor rejection, simply a thoughtful consideration that made the humid air feel suddenly sacred. He looked past the Sheikh toward the gym's single window, where Manila's chaotic streets pulsed with jeepneys and street vendors, his mind traveling south to Mindanao, where his Muslim brothers still struggled in communities torn between hope and violence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet firmness of someone who had learned that true wealth could never be deposited in banks or worn on the body. "Your Excellency," Manny began in Arabic before switching to English so everyone present could understand his heart completely, "I am honored beyond measure, but I cannot accept money for simply being myself, for living values that should belong to all humanity rather than become transactions for the privileged." He stood slowly, moving closer to the Sheikh with the respectful posture of someone addressing not wealth but genuine pain, his eyes meeting the older man's with compassion that transcended cultural boundaries. "Instead, let me propose something that would honor your son's memory in a way that creates life rather than simply commemorates death. We build a training center in Mindanao where Christian and Muslim youth can train side by side, learning that the discipline of boxing teaches respect stronger than any religious division." The Sheikh's eyes widened as Manny continued, his words painting a vision of a facility where children who had known only suspicion might discover brotherhood through shared struggle, where the heavy bag becomes a meditation and the ring becomes a classroom for dignity. Let Khalid's name mark not a tragedy's end, but a bridge's beginning, a place where your faith and mine stop being reasons for conflict and become conversations between friends who sweat and dream. Together, the portfolio slipped from the Sheikh's trembling hands, contracts scattering across the gym floor like leaves that no longer mattered, the numbers and clauses rendered meaningless by a proposal that addressed the actual wound in his heart. Around them, fighters who moments before had been calculating their own shares of imagined fortune now felt something larger moving through the room, a reminder that their struggling nation had always possessed a wealth that economics could never measure. Manny extended his hand, not in the gesture of a beggar seeking favors, but as an equal offering partnership in something greater than either man could build alone. His scarred knuckles, representing every Filipino who had chosen dignity over convenience. The Sheikh stared at that outstretched hand, as though seeing his son's own reaching back across the veil of death, as though this small boxer from a country he had barely known existed was somehow channeling Khalid's own dreams of using strength to unite rather than divide. Tears began streaming down the Sheikh's weathered face, cutting through years of grief that wealth had only decorated but never healed, his shoulders shaking with the release of carrying impossible sorrow alone for too long. He grasped Manny's hand with both of his own, bringing it to his forehead in a gesture of respect reserved for the most honored. Teachers and prophets, his voice breaking as he whispered acceptance in Arabic that everyone felt even without translation. The Sheikh's whispered Arabic grew clearer as he lifted his head, his tear-streaked face transformed by something between shock and spiritual recognition, his grip on Manny's hand tightening as though holding a lifeline. Thrown across decades of loss, you said al-quwwatu al-haqqiyatu fa-al-jisr, laysa fatra al-qabda. True strength lies in the bridge, not in the fist, he repeated in a trembling voice that made even those who couldn't understand Arabic feel the word's weight pressing against their chests. My father spoke this exact proverb to me 50 years ago in our family's courtyard in Abu Dhabi when I was young and angry, when I believed power meant dominance rather than connection, and I have not heard another soul speak these words since his death. The gym had become a cathedral of held breath, every fighter frozen in witness to something beyond their comprehension, yet undeniably sacred, the fluorescent lights seeming somehow softer, as though divine attention had turned its gaze toward this humble space. The Sheikh's voice broke again as he continued, I have traveled to champions in 6 countries, spoken with men whose names fill stadiums, and whose fists have conquered every opponent, yet none knew my language, and none touched the truth my father planted in my heart, like seeds waiting for impossible rain. Manny stood perfectly still, his own eyes now glistening because he understood the miraculous weight of this moment, how his late-night studies with worn Quran pages under a single bulb in General Santos City had somehow prepared him for a conversation that transcended mere words. A fisherman named Ibrahim taught me that proverb, Manny said softly in Arabic before returning to English, his voice carrying the humility of someone who never sought to be extraordinary, yet could not escape destiny's persistent hand. He told me that Allah gave us 2 hands, not to make fists against each other, but to build bridges, strong enough for everyone to cross, that the prophets were not remembered for their victories in battle, but for the connections they forged between hostile tribes. Around them, gym members began pulling out phones not to record for social media glory, but because they instinctively knew they were witnessing the kind of moment that redefines what strength actually means, that transforms a Manila boxing gym into ground where heaven and earth briefly touch. The Sheikh's bodyguards, stoic men trained to show no emotion, openly wiped their eyes as their employer embraced Manny with the desperate gratitude of a father finding his lost son on a crowded street. Khalid would have loved you, the Sheikh whispered against Manny's shoulder, his words muffled by fabric and emotion, yet heard clearly by everyone present through some acoustic miracle of perfect silence. The scattered contracts on the floor remained where they had fallen, forgotten documents representing a transaction that had transformed into a covenant, money that had become meaningless in the presence of actual treasure. Manny returned the embrace with the same strength he brought to championship fights, understanding that this moment demanded every ounce of his power channeled not into destruction, but into holding another human being together, while grief finally found its proper witness. The embrace lasted 7 heartbeats before the gym's silence shattered into something resembling controlled chaos, fighters rushing toward the scene not with aggression but with the magnetic pull of witnesses desperate to touch the edges of a miracle they would speak about for the rest of their lives. Coach Reyes stood frozen by the ring ropes, his weathered face streaming with tears he made no effort to hide, one gnarled hand pressed against his chest as though physically holding his heart inside his body, while the other gestured frantically at someone to capture this moment before it dissolved like morning mist. The Sheikh's youngest bodyguard, a man no older than 25, whose face had shown nothing but professional blankness until now, lowered his phone with trembling hands after recording the embrace, his whispered prayer in Arabic weaving through the gym's emotional atmosphere like incense rising toward heaven. Outside, Manila continued its oblivious evening rhythm of jeepney horns and street vendor calls, but inside, this converted Warehouse, time had bent itself around two men whose connection rewrote every fighter's understanding of what victory actually meant when measured against eternity's patient scales. Manny finally stepped back from the embrace, keeping one hand on the Sheikh's shoulder with the natural authority of someone who had carried the hopes of millions. Without ever forgetting his own humanity, his voice steady despite the emotion flickering across his face like candlelight against water. "Your Excellency, what we build together must have Khalid's name, not mine. Because monuments to the living become prisons, but memorials to those we have loved become gardens where new life grows in their honor," he said, switching seamlessly between Arabic and English so everyone present could follow the covenant being forged in real time. The Sheikh nodded with such vigor, his gutra shifted on his head, his hands gesturing expansively as though already seeing the training center rising from Mindanao's red earth, already hearing the sound of gloves hitting bags in rhythms that erased the ancient border's prejudice, had drawn between people who prayed in different directions, but bled the same crimson. Around them, fighters began embracing each other with unusual intensity, the scene's emotional gravity pulling everyone into its orbit like planets surrendering to an inevitable sun. Their diverse faces reflecting the Philippines' beautiful complexity of Tagalog and Visayan, Ilocano, and Bicolano, Muslim and Christian united under one leaking roof. The gym door burst open with such force it ricocheted against the wall, and suddenly journalists poured inside like floodwater breaching a dam, cameras hoisted on shoulders and microphones. Thrust forward, like weapons transformed into olive branches by the scene's overwhelming peace. "Tell us what happened," a reporter shouted in Tagalog, her voice cracking with the story-hunger journalists develop when they sense something larger than news unfolding before their professional eyes. Manny turned to face the cameras with the same calm composure he showed before championship fights, understanding that this moment would travel across oceans and languages, would reach living rooms in Abu Dhabi and villages in Mindanao, would perhaps inspire others to build bridges where walls currently stood dividing human beings from their own brothers. The Sheikh stood beside him, their shoulders touching in unconscious solidarity, and when Manny began explaining in simple words what had transpired, the gym's fluorescent light seemed to brighten as though even electricity recognized the presence of something genuinely illuminating, something that would not fade when the cameras finally stopped recording. The viral video reached 10 million views before midnight, showing two men from different worlds, speaking the same ancient language of respect. And in living rooms across the archipelago, parents woke their sleeping children to watch the clip, understanding instinctively that witnessing goodness plants seeds that might take years to bloom, but never truly die once rooted. In young hearts, 6 months after that viral embrace, the morning sun rose over Mindanao like a promise finally kept, its golden light washing across the Khalid Memorial Peace Center, where 200 children from 17 different communities gathered for the grand opening ceremony that would be broadcast to 43 countries, waiting to witness what reconciliation looked like when measured in square feet of training mats and shared dreams instead of political speeches. Manny stood at the entrance beside the Sheikh, both men visibly older somehow despite the short time elapsed, aged not by years but by the weight of carrying hope for thousands who desperately needed proof that coexistence was not naive fantasy but achievable reality. Behind them, the facility stretched across 3 acres of land where conflict had once drawn invisible borders, now transformed into a space where Christian and Muslim youth wrapped each other's hands before sparring, where coaches taught discipline in Tagalog and Arabic interchangeably, where the only flag hanging in the main hall showed not any nation, but simply 2 hands clasped in mutual respect above the words "strength through understanding," carved in 6 languages. The ribbon-cutting ceremony proceeded with unusual solemnity. government officials from Manila standing beside imams and priests who had agreed to jointly bless the facility in a religious collaboration that would have seemed impossible just 1 year prior. When Manny's scissors finally severed the ribbon, the gathered children erupted not into chaotic celebration, but into a synchronized demonstration of footwork and shadowboxing they had secretly rehearsed for weeks, their movements creating a living wave of coordination that swept across the courtyard like visual proof that harmony required practice, but was infinitely learnable. The Sheikh covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking with the kind of tears that carried both grief for what was lost and gratitude for what was being born from that loss, while Manny placed a gentle hand on his back with the understanding of someone who had transformed his own poverty and pain into purpose rather than bitterness. In the crowd, the Muslim fisherman from General Santos City stood with his grandchildren, his weathered face reflecting pride at seeing the young boy he had once taught now teaching the world that greatness was measured not in championship belts displayed, but in barriers demolished. Beside him, Coach Reyes wept openly for perhaps the third time in his 70-year life, watching his fighter achieve a victory no referee could score, but every heart could feel, understanding finally that he had not trained a boxer, but had witnessed the forging of something closer to a prophet who spoke not in revelations, but in left hooks and compassion combined into an irresistible force. The cameras captured it all, but for once the participants barely noticed the lenses, too absorbed in the moment's genuine transcendence to perform for posterity, too present in the miracle of children laughing across former dividing lines to worry about how it looked from angles designed for viral consumption rather than authentic transformation. The final shot showed Manny and the Sheikh walking among the training children as sunset painted the sky in colors no flag could claim. Two fathers who had lost and found different things now united in legacy, their shadows stretching across the mats like bridges, proving that the Philippines was not merely a nation, but a living answer to the question of whether love could actually conquer the fear that keeps humanity trapped in cycles of division. And in that golden hour, watching those children train together, the answer resonated with the clarity of a bell calling the faithful toward something worth believing in again. What bridges are you building in your own community that future generations will walk across? Subscribe to witness more stories that prove our shared humanity is stronger than any force trying to divide us.